Sorry, we are running out of time. Please keep him very close. Thank you. We have the last presentation of this session. So, okay.
Are you going to use this?
I have
No.
my USB.
I mean, pointer.
Oh, I have to have my phone.
Oh.
It's a long day. This is the last presentation of this session, 7, by Muyi from Osaka University. The title is Conditionals meets anaphoricity, why some interrogatives about conditionals can't be asked. Please welcome her.
Okay, thank you. My name is Muyi. I come from Osaka University in Japan. So I was intimidated before coming because I'm not a syntactician and I don't know anything about the miracle creed. But Myung-Won gave me the opportunity to present anyway, so thank you very much. So I'm going to talk about semantics and specifically about conditionals today. Before we get started, I did not submit my slides before the conference, so if you want to take a look at the slides, you can go to my website, ym.github.io, or scan this QR code. It will take you to my homepage, and then you scroll down, and in the list of presentations, you will find a link to the slides. I'll give you a sec to do this. Okay. So I'll get started. So we know that in natural language, conditionals allow their consequence to be constituted by various clause types. Just measure my time myself. So you could say things like, if it rains tomorrow, I will stay at home, or we will stay at home, or stay at home. All of these are fine. Today, I would like to talk about the interaction between conditionals with WH interrogatives. So far in formal semantics, most of the work on conditional questions focus on cases where the WH word is inside the consequent clause. So sentences like, if it rains tomorrow, who will stay at home? However, today I'm going to focus on a slightly different construction, namely conditional questions about elements inside the antecedent clause. And I'm going to sometimes call them antecedent questions. So I think everybody in this room knows that English does not allow antecedent questions because there is a locality violation if you want to construe those constructions. So you cannot say in English, who will John be surprised if Mary gives a present to? Under the interpretation, who is it such that John will be surprised if Mary gives a present to that person? However, in many double-chain languages, this type of questions are possible. So in Japanese, you could very naturally ask who, so essentially this is a sentence that means, if Mary gives a present to whom, John will be surprised. And similarly, you can do that in Korean as well. So the phenomenon that I would like to explore today is a specific constraint on antecedent questions. Namely that in both Japanese and Korean, there is an adverb that roughly means something like in case or supposedly. So in Japanese, that's moshi. In Korean, it's manyak. Roughly, these are elements that try to signal the low likeliness of a possibility, right? So the constraint is that these adverbs seem to cause degradation of antecedent questions. So number 6 is the same question of Japanese with moshi added to the front, and somehow it sounds a little bit funny. People don't really like it. And according to what I have heard from Andong, the variant of this the counterpart of this in Korean is also slightly degraded. Note that we don't have this sort of effect for consequent questions. So if you want to ask if Mary gives a present to Bill, who will be most surprised? It really doesn't matter if you have the moshi and the antecedent. So the constraint is specifically for antecedent questions. So in the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus specifically on Japanese, but if you have any feedback or observations about Korean, please let me know. So very briefly about on the gist of my analysis. So the main point of the main takeaway message of this talk is that the anomaly of antecedent questions with moshi is really just another instantiation of the parallel between definite descriptions, so definite DPs, of individuals and definite descriptions of possible worlds. So it's about a parallel between two semantic domains, the domains of individuals and the domains of possible worlds. Specifically, I'm going to combine two assumptions that are motivated independently in the literature. The first one is that interrogatives about elements inside anaphoric definite DPs are not acceptable because they are semantically trivial. So in this example, for example, you have a dialogue where A starts by saying, guess what I saw on Mary's desk? A passport picture. And then B responded, really? Who did you see the passport picture of? So here, the DP is anaphoric to the indefinite DP in the previous, in the preceding discourse. And in this case, the question is not acceptable. The second, okay, should be number 2. The second assumption that I'm going to adopt is actually my own argument, that conditional antecedents with moshi are actually anaphoric definite descriptions of possible worlds. Okay? Now combining these two, I'm going to argue that interrogatives about elements inside anaphoric definite descriptions of possible worlds, in this particular case, conditional antecedents with moshi, are unacceptable for exactly the same reason, for the semantic triviality of the construction. So 11 is just the same sentence that we have seen earlier. Basically, the gist is that whatever accounts for the badness of 10 is going to account for the badness of 11 as well. Okay. So roadmap, I'm going to first of all talk about the interaction between anaphoricity and double questions, and then talk about how it extends to conditionals. So the first two sections are really about observations, empirical evidence. And then in section 3, I'm going to introduce a particular semantic account of anaphoric islands, and in section 4, I'm going to try to extend that to antecedent questions. I think I'll probably focus on section 1, 2, 3, and enter section 4 only if we have time. Okay. I should also mention that this project stems from my dissertation in chapter 3 of my dissertation published last year. I'm going to omit a lot of technical stuff today, so if you want to look at the full analysis, please go to this link and take a look. I'll also be trying to make this into a public journal publication, so if you have any comments, please do let me know. Okay, and first, the introductory questions. So it is very well known in the literature of syntax that definite DPs have some sort of blocking effect on double extraction. So the widely reported intuition is that double extraction out of the DPs has some sort of intermediate status. So 12 is the standard paradigm that has been presented in the literature. So extraction out of a DP is perfect, but out of the DP is slightly degraded. But compare this with extraction out of that DP, it's slightly better. So it's in the middle. However, this paradigm recently has welcomed a semantic twist, namely that Semantics in 2015 shows that the intermediate status of this extraction out of the DP is actually caused by the failure to control for a very important semantic factor, namely the anaphoricity of the DP. So in order to look at her account, we have to look at, first of all, the basic distinction between these two types of definites. So I'm going to follow Roberts and a lot of other authors that distinguish between two different types of definite DPs. So on the one hand, there are non-anaphoric DPs. So these are definites that just require uniqueness, right? So for example, the sun is shining. In this case, we know by our world knowledge that there is exactly one sun. So the requirement is satisfied. Or cases like superlatives, I climbed the highest mountain of Africa, or I forgot the beginning of World War I. For example, in C, the lexical meaning of beginning necessarily ensures that the uniqueness requirement is satisfied. So these are all cases of non-anaphoric definites. On the other hand, there are anaphoric definites which require previously established source reference. In those cases, uniqueness is not required. For example, in 14, if you have a discourse where you're saying, I saw a man and a woman yesterday, the man told me a story. Now, in this case, it doesn't matter how many men there are in your context, because in this case, the man is specifically picking out whoever it is that is introduced by the previous indefinite DP. Similarly, for 15, I met a man yesterday, the elderly gentleman told me a story. Similarly, in this case, the definite is picking up the same individual. In this case, specifically, it also adds the requirement that that person is an elderly gentleman, but it's basically the same thing. Now, if you look at languages, some dialects of German, we actually see a morphological distinction between these two types. So if you're interested, take a look at Florian Schwartz's dissertation. Okay, so now we can look at the interaction with double interrogatives. So Semanenko shows that once we have controlled for anaphoricity, it will become clear immediately that it is actually anaphoricity that induces island. It's not definiteness that's doing the trick. So first of all, let's see double extraction out of non-anaphoric definites. Okay, so Semanenko shows that these cases are acceptable as long as we make sure that the uniqueness presupposition is satisfied. So for example, in 16, if we set up a context where we know that there's exactly one picture for every relevant individual, and then you ask, who did you show me the picture of? This is fine. Also with the cases where the lexical meaning of the description ensures uniqueness, it's perfect to ask the question, which word did you forget at the beginning of? That's also fine. On the other hand, if we try double extraction out of anaphoric definites, this is the data that I showed you at the beginning. So again, it's a dialogue where A starts by saying, guess what I saw on Mary's desk? A passport picture. Here you're introducing a new discourse reference with the indefinite DP. And then B responds, really, who did you see the passport picture of? Here you're trying to do an extraction out of a anaphoric the DP, and in this case, it's undemocratic. Okay, so that's it for the anaphoric versus non-anaphoric distinction. Next, I'm going to show you that this distinction actually has a correlate in the domain of possible worlds. Okay, so before I enter the main data, just a very brief introduction of the basic profile of Japanese conditionals. It's very similar in Korean, so it should be pretty straightforward. So Japanese conditionals are arbitrarily marked by conditional suffixes or enclitics. So the thing that roughly means if, you normally find it as a verbal suffix in the antecedent, right? There are at least 4 different types, but and all of them have slightly different meanings, but I'm going to ignore those differences today. And on the other, at the same time, conditional antecedents can be accompanied by the adverb moshi. So 20 and 20 is basically the same sentence as 19, only with moshi in the front. It's basically the same, exactly the same meaning. So far, moshi looks pretty optional. But in one of my previous works, I have argued that it's actually semantically not optional because I argued that moshi has an effect of enforcing anaphoricity. And here's how I have motivated my account. So the basic assumption that I have adopted in that account is that conditional antecedents are definite descriptions of possible worlds following Schlenker. And the gist of what I have argued for moshi is basically that there is a perfect parallel between what we see in conditionals and what we see in definite DPs. Namely, what moshi does to an antecedent clause in a conditional is just like what an indefinite determiner does to a definite DPs. There's a perfect parallel. So roughly, the idea is that without moshi, the antecedent clause are non-anaphoric plural definites. So if you have Miyaji ga kureba, if Mary comes, John will also come. Roughly, the paraphrase of this antecedent clause is going to be something like the worlds where Mary comes. So you're picking out the worlds where Mary comes. And the entire sentence says that those worlds are the worlds where John also comes. Okay? What happens when moshi comes in is that antecedent clause will become anaphoric and singular definites. Again, to see the paraphrase, so moshi Miyaji ga kureba, if Mary comes with moshi. What happens is basically that moshi is kind of like an indefinite, singular indefinite, that introduces a world. I'm writing situations here, but you can think of this as a world. It introduces a new world that the speaker has in mind. And the pink part is referring, being anaphoric to that world that the speaker has introduced. So there is a situation, and then that situation, which is also a situation where Mary comes, verifies John's coming. That's roughly what this means. Now, note that here I'm actually making 2 claims. That moshi forces anaphoricity on the one hand, and also it forces singularity on the other hand. So those are 2 different claims. Now I'm going to give you a very quick introduction of my motivation for those 2 claims. Though I have to admit that the argument is not perfect, because my motivation that moshi forces singularity is direct. I have direct empirical evidence for that. But the motivation that moshi forces anaphoricity mainly comes from compositionality. So it's an assumption such that if we adopt it, we can make semantic composition work very nicely. So it's not really comparable, but this is the best that I have achieved so far. Okay, so the diagnostics, so the evidence that moshi forces singularity. Now, first of all, we don't have morphological markers for plurality and singularity of possible worlds, right? So we have to establish a diagnostics for that. Now, here's how I have done it. Since David Muyi's work in the 70s, we know that English if clauses can restrict adverbs of quantification. So if Mary comes, John always, usually, sometimes, never comes too. These sentences roughly get the interpretation some cases where Mary comes are cases where John comes. So in these cases, the antecedent is restricting the adverbs here. Okay? Now, independently, we know that adverbs of quantification require their restrictors to describe multiple events. This is a completely independent observation. So if we consider the contrast between 24A and B, so first of all, when Robert died, his eldest son usually inherited his fortune. Now in this case, the when clause here, it's supposed to restrict usually, right? But the content described by the when clause, it's really just about one single event, the event of Robert dying. Right? And because it describes just one event, the quantification here does not work, because usually it requires at least 2, maybe 3 events. On the other hand, if we switch from Robert to an Earl, to an indefinite, the sentence all of a sudden becomes good, because in this case, the when clause describes multiple events, each event being a different Earl dying. That's why it becomes good. Okay. So from this, we can conclude, we can therefore use adverbs of quantification as a diagnostic for the plurality of conditional antecedent. And if we, again, look at what we have seen in 23, we already know that English if clauses can restrict adverbs of quantification, so we can conclude very safely that English if clauses are plural definite descriptions of possible worlds. Okay? That's what we learned about English. Now, going back to Muyi, what happens is that in Japanese, if we look at the same phenomenon, by default, conditional antecedents are plural, just like English if clauses. So 25 is a sentence that means, if I get on a plane, I usually feel sick. So here we have the adverb kaite, usually, in the consequent. Very naturally, we get a sentence, we get an interpretation that says, most cases where I get on a plane are cases where I feel sick. So quantification here is successful. We can conclude that the antecedent clause here by default is plural, same as English. However, what happens is that once we have added Muyi to the sentence becomes quite odd. So Muyi quote inoreba, if I get on a plane, I usually feel sick. Exactly the same, only with Muyi added to the front. In this case, we can take the badness of this sentence as the evidence that Muyi is forcing singularity of conditional antecedent. Okay, so that was the argument for singularity. Now moving on to anaphoricity. So basically, how I captured this compositionally is that without Muyi, the antecedent and the conditional antecedent is basically just a non-anaphoric definite of possible worlds. And what it does is that it introduces a new discourse referent that refers to possible worlds, right? So, if Mary comes, John will come too. In this case, the pink part, the antecedent, is basically just introducing a new discourse reference that stores the world where Mary comes. So it's very similar to cases like the first visitors to our house brought wine and cheese. Here you're having a plural non-anaphoric definite DP as well. What happens with Muyi is that Muyi itself is like a singular indefinite determiner. Muyi by itself introduces a new singular discourse reference, and the rest of the antecedent picks up that referent by anaphora. So if Mary comes, this Muyi is kind of like things like a man in a sequence. I met a man yesterday. And is basically picking up exactly the same word that is introduced by the proof part. Similarly to what we see in 30. More specifically, the contribution of the description is presuppositional. So in the normal DP case, the individual introduced by a man has to be an elderly gentleman. That's what's required by the DP part. Similarly, for 29, the world introduced by Muyi is presupposed to be a world where Mary comes. Okay? Again, it's a perfect parallel between the two domains. Okay, so far what I have shown you is that there is a full parallel non-anaphoric definite versus anaphoric definites. For words, there is the same distinction between antecedents without moiety versus antecedents with moiety. Next, I'm going to show you the analysis focusing on the interaction between anaphoricity and verbiage interrogatives. Okay, so Semantics. So now I'm going to introduce Semantics account of anaphoric islands. Keep in mind that this is going to be a semantic account. Okay. So the basics first. Semantics of anaphoricity. So Semantics assumes that non-anaphoric definites denote the unique individual that satisfies the description and presupposes uniqueness. So this is just standard semantics, right? So under the non-anaphoric use takes a property and picks out a unique individual that satisfies that property P, right? So the cat, you're just picking out the unique cat in your domain. Anaphoric definites has a semantics that built on the semantics of non-anaphoric the, because it has a extra pronominal argument that is built by a silent pronoun. This is kind of a standard assumption in the literature so far. So so in the structure, in addition to taking an NP, it's also taking a silent pronoun, in this case alpha 2. The semantics is such that it's going to take a property and takes an individual that is denoted by the silent pronoun alpha 2 and picks out the unique individual that satisfies the property and is identical to the individual denoted by alpha 2. Okay? Now, because the only individual that is identical with y is y itself, we can reduce this to this. So it's taking a property and an individual, presupposes that that individual satisfies the property, and picks out that individual denoted by alpha 2. So John saw a cat on the street this afternoon. That cat purred, because this is an anaphoric use. The cat has this extra pronominal slot. The entire thing with respect to an assignment function is going to pick out, so g of 2 is going to be the individual denoted by this silent pronoun, and presupposes that that individual is a cat. Okay, now adding interrogatives. So I'm running out of time, so I'll try to leave out the technical stuff. But the basic assumptions about questions is such that I'm going to assume that questions denote a set of possible answers, so standard handling semantics, and presupposes that at least one possible answer is defined and true. So for the case, again, in the context, we ensure that every individual has a unique picture. Who did you show me the picture of? Let's suppose that the question has two possible answers. You showed me the picture of Anne, and you showed me the picture of Bill. Each of them presupposes that there is a unique picture of Anne for the first answer and Bill for the second answer. Right? And in addition to these two presuppositions of the possible answers, the entire question also has its own presupposition. Namely that, in this case, there is an individual such that you showed me the picture of that individual, and that individual has a unique picture. Now, in order to check whether a context satisfies these presuppositions, especially because here we have two levels of presuppositions, right? Presuppositions of the possible answers and the entire questions. Now, Semanenko assumes that to ask the question felicitously, all worlds in the context should satisfy the presupposition of the entire question, and also the presupposition of at least one possible answer. Now, for this case, let's try to check one context. Let's imagine a context where we have two worlds. W1, where you showed me the picture of Anne, and both of them have a unique picture, and W2, where you showed me the picture of Bill. Both of them have a unique picture. Now you can check that in this case, actually both of the presuppositions are satisfied, so there's no problem asking this question. Now I'm running out of time, but let me show you just the part of the idea very quickly. For the anaphoric cases, we are having an additional pronominal slot see the passport picture of, the assertive content of the possible answers are going to be the same. You saw G2 and you saw G2. They only differ in terms of their presuppositions because the only role that the passport picture, the description passport picture plays is presuppositional in this case. Okay? And again, presupposes that you saw G2 and there's an individual such that G2 is the passport picture of that person. Now, I think I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to show you what's happening. Going to show you the overview of what's happening here. When you try to check the presuppositions, these two presuppositions against a particular context, there are only two possibilities that we will end up with. The first possibility is that we will have one type of context will be such that the presuppositions are not satisfied. And that's the second possibility is that the presuppositions are satisfied, but in those contexts, necessarily the speaker already knows the answer. So the question ends up with a trivial semantics. Okay? That's the reason why these type of questions cannot be asked, because there is a semantic pragmatic triviality problem. Okay, I can come back to this in the Q&A if people want to look at it in a little bit more details. Just to show you very briefly what happens for the conditional cases, the gist is basically that it's exactly the same for the conditional cases. So basically the idea is that the parallel extends further to questions. Because whenever we have a Muyi in the antecedent, there will be, just like the DP cases, there will be an additional silent pronoun in the conditional antecedent. And that's going to cause exactly the same trouble as what is making 49 bad. Okay? Again, the technical details really doesn't matter. What I really wanted to tell you today is that there is a perfect parallel between these two cases. And I hope I have already done that. Okay, let me just wrap up very quickly. Skipping all of these. In addition to the data that I have shown you, there's actually some ways to obviate the effect of Muyi in antecedent, namely that you could switch the order of the double word and Muyi, and that will somehow make the question sound better. And for some speakers, you could also obviate the badness by stressing the double word. That sometimes also helps for some speakers. So the question is how to account for these effects. And one possibility for me to pursue in the future is perhaps scrambling an emphatic accent. What they are doing is that they force the double word to scope out of the antecedent clause. So in those cases, the questions are really not about elements inside the Muyi antecedents to begin with. So whatever was causing the trouble, anaphoricity island is not applicable in these cases. And we actually have the same independent evidence for this from embedded questions. So in Japanese, if you have a double word in the embedded clause, by default, you're going to get an embedded interrogative. But when you stress it, or when you front it out of the embedded clause, you're going to get a long-distance question. The double word is going to associate with the matrix question marker. So I'm suspecting that we're having the same effect in conditionals as well. Okay, so that was a little fast. Thank you for listening, and I'll take questions.
Thank you for the presentation. We only have 5 minutes for the discussion. Any questions or comments? Oh, please.
Thank you for your talk. I enjoyed it a lot. I have one short comment that suggests a parallel between the stress pattern that you just mentioned at the very end with definite descriptions themselves too. That more recent analyses of definite descriptions say that the empty part is always presupposed, or at least not an issue, right? So the linguist, the only thing that's asserted is the G of 2, for example, the anaphora. But if you stress either the entire NP or subsets of NP, then it actually enters the asserted content. So that seems to be very similar to what's happening in the stress.
Interesting. Is that about English?
English, yes.
Okay.
English for sure, and for other languages that have that numerical.
Okay, do you know which authors are good for that?
I can send you a list. I have several references. Yep.
Yeah.
And one other question I had, I really like this parallel between individuals and situations or worlds and definiteness. But in the individual part, there are two presuppositions that come with definition, right? Existence and uniqueness. I think you showed very nicely the singularity, that there's a unique situation. But is there really an existence presupposition for when you have questions that, for example, your English translation was there is a situation, and in that situation there comes, but would that be guaranteed that there is always an accessible situation?
I think it will because, so for normal indicative conditionals, I think that will be guaranteed because indicative mood, however you calculate that, is going to presuppose that there is, it's going to presuppose that the antecedent worlds are accessible from the speaker's point of view. If that's not satisfied, the speaker is supposed to switch to counterfactual, so it's adjunctive mood. So I think as long as the mood is indicative, that should be satisfied. Yeah.
Yep. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, do you have any other questions or comments? We only have 3 minutes. Okay.
Yeah, thank you for the very interesting talk. So I have a kind of naive question about whether how you can extend this idea to other cases. Like, I don't know, do you find other definite expressions other than individual situations? Like, or have you ever thought about it?
Interesting. So I know people have art. So this parallel between different semantic domains has been pretty popular recently. So the same extension parallel has been argued for the domains of degrees, times, events, and so on and so forth. For example, Barbara Partee has, in her earlier work in the 70s and the 80s, she argues that, for example, when clauses referring to times can be either anaphoric or non-anaphoric, similar to what we see here for TPs. But I don't know if there's any evidence for, so a natural question for me to ask is what's going to happen for extraction out of when clauses when you very clearly distinguish between the two interpretations, right? Now, I don't know the answer, but yeah, the parallel has been observed for other domains.
Yeah. I was kind of trying to play around with Jag instead. I was thinking of like reason clause. Because in English, right, you have because, as, and since, and since sounds like kind of a bit like there's a presupposition.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, in Japanese, we don't express the difference only on their reasoning, like sentence that had to find out complementizer, but actually had like some in the first place. So,
And that's non-anaphoric?
sounds more anaphoric, I guess. Like,誰を呼んだからメアリーが怒ったの？Why? Who did Mary get angry because you invited? Of course, in English it's that, but in Japanese it's fine. But そもそも誰を呼んだからメアリーが怒ったの？Who did Mary get? English. Who did Mary get angry? Since or because you invited in the first place. Sounds worse to me, and I don't know why. If this is related to what you're saying, that would be cool, but yeah.
That's interesting. So we need to find evidence for whether somosomo is anaphoric to begin with. So that's the task.
Course,
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Because of the time limitation, yeah, let's wrap up for this session. Thank you for the talk and discussion.
Thank you.